All right. I am Odyssean, and this is what I learned in a decade of game mastering. Well, actually, it's technically most of what I've learned in a decade of game mastering. So, yeah, I have been a game master about 14 years now. I have ran Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Oh, are we getting echo? Am I echoing? Shouldn't be echo. Is this any better? Am I not echoing anymore? All right. I've been game mastering for 14 years. I have run my browser's been muted. It looks like I had a secondary mic show up on my Anyway, that's taken care of. I have ran everything from Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, D&D 3.5, some D&D 4th that I won't talk about because of reasons. A little bit of D&D 5e, but not a lot. Pathfinder 1st edition. I've run Shadowrun 4th edition, 5th edition, Fate, Vampire, Requiem, and Masquerade. I've run a lot of games. I have been, yeah, I've done this a lot, and I've learned quite a bit in that time. And I thought I'd share that to help you, as either a game master or player, someone who's just interested in tabletop, have a better time with your games. So, first up, whoop, no, I want to keep the dice. The dice are fun. So you want to run a game. That's very blurry. Everything I do is blurry. That's kind of how it goes. So you have an idea for a game to run. That's fantastic. More power to you. But now it's kind of the tricky part, which is getting the game started. This has been kind of the crux of a lot of it. And it's kind of tricky, especially right now. Almost all the games I'm running are online. The only one I've been trying to do in person are people of my own household that I live with. So, unfortunately, how to find players isn't within the scope of this. I'm still figuring out how to find players after 14 years. But finding people who are interested in your game and will stick with your game is tricky. But I do have some tips about keeping it from fizzling in the first sessions. So, the biggest one for how to get a game going is figure out what is bringing players to your table. And this can be all kinds of things. I remember when I started game mastering, I was gaming with friends, and they were just looking for something to do that was social. They were wanting to have time spent with people. And that was their primary motivation, was just hanging out with friends. What we played, what the game was about, wasn't super important to them. They just wanted to hang out with cool people who they could get along with. Sometimes gaming is a form of escapism. Getting away from the stresses of life. This is also the same reason that people, get sucked into series on TV or into other channels or get really engrossed in a book. They're trying to, unwind. Some people want the ultimate and interactive player experiences, like the ultimate video game. And tabletop is great for that. It's whatever you want it to be. And then some people just want to beat monsters. But these aren't just the only reasons. In fact, you're not limited to just one reason. And as a game master, it's kind of an important thing to figure out what is bringing a player to your table. Why are they wanting to play in your game? Are, their friends saying, hey, you should check this out? Are they just wanting to hang out with people? Is there something that they want to try? Like they've never played Cyberpunk and you're running a Cyberpunk game, so they might hop in. These are things to think about. I remember that, that's an important step to keeping players engaged. I remember in a game I played in where I built a character all about talking. It was a face. It was a grizzled monster hunter who was, trying to track down the monster that had left him blind in one eye. And then the campaign ended up being about a series of Colosseum fights. Just endless Colosseum fights. So all the stuff I put into Charisma, all the backstory I did as a player, weren't there for me. And so I ended up being very unengaged in that game. And that brings me to my next point, which is, as a game master, putting together sort of what I'd call the promise. And this kind of comes into... I'm going to get rid of my grid for a moment so this is actually easier to read. Promise and premise. These are basically what you're saying when you set up the game. I'm going to be running an adventure that's going to focus heavily on corporate intrigue. Is something the players need to be knowing if they're going to be playing in Shadowrun with you before they build their Mohawked Street Sam who doesn't know how to spell intrigue. That doesn't necessarily mean that they can't play that character in this game, but if you say that you're building a game around a specific aspect, focusing on a specific style of storytelling, or on a specific theme, that's kind of a promise to the players. It's part of your premise. This is where you say, hey, we're going to fight a lot of undead. If you're playing in certain editions of Dungeons and Dragons and Pathfinder, Rangers in particular have a favored enemy. Favored enemies are neat, but thematically they can be very difficult to pull off once you get into the mechanics of the game. Because you kind of have to know beforehand, what are we going to be seeing a lot of? Otherwise, if you build something specifically to be narrative, oh yeah, I absolutely despise goblins because they raided my village as a child. And so you set your favorite enemy as goblins, but the game master's not focusing on goblins. The campaign revolves around the undead. This becomes a problem because now there's a disconnect between what your character motivations are and what the story is set up to provide. As a game master, you can sort of, shift things around. We have ultimate freedom. We can make anything happen. And so it's important to engage with players, motivations. And this is kind of where, I believe it's Brandon Sanderson. He has the 3 Ps. You have the promise, you have progress, and you have the payoff. You say, I promise that this game is going to be about, the undead. We're going to be fighting undead. That's the promise. As you make your way through, you work your way up from skeletons to wights, and you start fighting harder and harder undead. That's progress. And you can also have the bits of story in here where it's like, why the undead? What's causing them? And then you have the payoff, which is the end, which would be like your Lich Necromancer. I can't spell. So these are the 3 parts. And it's kind of a good idea to have these 3 Ps thought about. They don't have to be absolute, nothing set in stone. But knowing what your game is going to focus on is an important part to making sure you can actually deliver on that game. So, for example, I'm currently running a game that is not combat heavy. I made this very apparent when I put together the players for it. So I'm running a game focused on adventure. It's all about exploration. It's all about discovery. That's not to say that there aren't fights planned. There's not going to be zero combat, but combat is going to be taking a second seat to discovery, to the exploration, to finding things out and putting clues together. So this is the game I have promised. I basically came up straight and said, hey, lots of adventure, lots of role play about characters and motivations, some combat, but it's not a focus, so don't worry too heavily about building combat-specific or combat-capable characters. I'm not looking for the traditional party of fighter with their big sword and mage with their magic staff. That's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for the people behind that. Who is the person wielding the sword? What do they want? What are they looking for? Who is this mage? Why did they become a mage? Like, what are they doing with that? Why are they on this expedition? These are what the game is focusing on. So I set that up in my premise. And this is a important part of keeping players engaged, because if you don't let your players know what your game's going to be focusing on and they build something that's incongruous with the type of story you're telling, not the meat of the story, but just the style of story you'll be telling, you're both not going to have a great time. Players are going to lose engagement, and you're going to get frustrated when the players don't engage with things that you put there to be interacted with. And this comes in, oh, fantastic, $200 donations. Oh, fantastic. Woo, keep those coming. This is where the collaborative, keeping players in line who are basically being trolly towards the DM, trying to break story on session 1. This is basically the part where you come in and say, this is not the game that I set out to tell. People who try to break the game are frustrating. And I've been my share of that player. This brings me actually to the second part of this exploration of everything I've learned. Collaborative storytelling. Players who are being trolly and trying to make the story about something else, trying to break the session 1, the premise. You all meet in a tavern. I don't go into the tavern. Okay, well, that's kind of on you. That's kind of on the player, not the GM, because you already said this is the premise of the story. We're going to go fight this eldritch horror. The player trying to make this about, well, no, the crooked mayor is trying to take the family farm, and that's my focus. That's not what the game master has promised. It's kind of well, you came here for a game, but you didn't come here for the game I'm running. And making that clear is the important part of putting the game together before you even get to session 1. So my advice to deal with players is deal with it out of character if they're trying to break the game, and set up the expectations of what the game will revolve around beforehand. Chaotic Neutral will do that. As Faulty Draw says, 3 guys playing Chaotic Neutral and they thought it meant messing up all my notes and story. And that's kind of a flaw in a lot of alignment systems. I've actually just gotten rid of alignment completely in almost all of my campaigns. I find that it makes for rather uninteresting characters. It makes for forced plot points. It's not conducive to building a fully realized character. They're meant to be used as guidelines, but more often than not, they're more effective as they're in effect as laws. Yes, I have ran into players who've claimed to play in alignment but only do evil stuff. And that's what my character would do. That is perhaps one of the least fun things in all of tabletop. But this is what my character would do. On the surface, it doesn't seem terrible. You're playing a specific character and they behave in a certain manner. You expect them to behave in a certain manner. I actually was this player relatively recently in my brother's intro campaign. He wanted us to get on a boat, but we hadn't really even formed the party yet because it was sort of in media res. We weren't just there. So the story basically went that there were 3 of us on our way to a place called Ferroton. Ferroton is home of the Knights of the Temple, an ancient order shrouded in mystery from the days before magic was outlawed. And I'm playing a tabaxi rogue with a focus on bushcraft and basically like a kind of a ranger without having to deal with an animal companion and all the problems that brings. Well, we stop off in a town along the way on our way to Ferroton. We stop in a town called Sybil. Because this is where the baggage train that we are with, the carts and the covered wagons, decides to spend the night. So we end up in Sybil. And I get a room at an inn, as do the other 2 players. One of the players goes off and sneaks out in the night to do something that they're wanting to do. There's an island in the lake, and they're like, I want to go check out that island. And so they go down to check on the island, and they drag along the other player with them. And they end up hiring a boat to go out to this island, and there's a city guard that goes with them. And my brother's just like, okay, so you get to this island, and you're at these ruins, and I need perception checks from everyone. And I'm like, am I there? I'm like, what? I don't think I got on the boat. This guy, this Quibbly Dunger, that's the other player's character's name, has been acting very suspicious. I find them weird and off-putting. I'm not going to get on a boat with them. And that was me doing that's what my character would do. And I didn't catch it until after it had already happened and I wasn't on the boat. And this is, a problem. Because now I've basically derailed my brother's story. My character's no longer involved. And I've kind of broke things. I made that mistake. And I didn't recognize it until I got to that point. I was like, well, that's part of the issue. That's part of the premise. The story I was promised is that we'd be going to Ferroton to investigate this order of knights. So my tabaxi rogue's obsession, because in D&D 5e, characters have, especially catfolk tabaxi have an obsession, something that they fixate on, and I had chosen legends and lore about the Temple Knights. So I'd been promised that we'd be going to Ferrotin for the Temple Knights. And instead, we're going to this island, and my brother did a pretty good job of GMing that. He took an encounter that was supposed to happen elsewhere and said, there's no reason it can't happen here, and he put it in that town. But then I broke it, because it wasn't what I was promised, it wasn't what I was expecting, and it's what my character would do. So that's kind of the problem of what would my character do. And this is where collaborative storytelling comes in. It's frustrating when a player derails your story. It's frustrating as a player when the GM forces you into a plot. So basically saying, you were on the boat and you went to this island and you were in the ruins. Like, well, I didn't do any of that. That's the GM forcing me to enter this encounter that they have planned. So we're both at fault there, and that's part of the collaborative nature of storytelling. Is tabletop doesn't happen without players and a game master. So players that try to center the game around something that's not part of the premise is on the player. This is something to be addressed more often than not outside of character. There are ways you can do this, though, that incorporate things into your story. And this is probably the biggest and most important thing I have learned after 14 years of game mastering. I barely do any planning. I don't have exact scenes planned out ahead of time. I have what I call story beats. These are the important parts of the story where something happens. So, for example, I ran a 24-session campaign from 1 to 20. Big epic game. Took a whole year to do. We were gaming 8 hours a week, every week. And the story was something along the lines of, we were called in to investigate a dwarven mining rig that had suddenly stopped working. And the ultimate culmination was we're fighting a cult that has been trying to get an artifact uncovered in those mines by the dwarves that could bring about the end of the world. And so the way that I set that story up is I had part 1, mining rig. And then I had sabotage. It was sabotaged. I didn't have exact details of how it was sabotaged, because those weren't as important. So, like, in Act 1, this is kind of the shape of it. The players were already part of a group that was being sent out to do a thing. They find out that the machines aren't working. If they pay any attention at all, it becomes obvious that someone stopped them from working. They sabotaged it. Then the saboteur breaks something else while they're there. That's the majority of Act 1. So it doesn't hinge on the players really learning anything. There's no single clue or piece of information that's critical that they know. Because part of the story is they encounter the saboteur in the act. So they don't have to realize that it was sabotage that stopped the mining rig. They just have to, it's not working. That's why they've been sent here. That's the premise of why the adventure's beginning. And then the world is alive and does things even if they don't. The saboteur breaks something that suddenly makes it the player's focus. And it's now about them. They're down in the mining rig. They've delved into the mine. The saboteur breaks the cable winch system to lift them back up as they're waiting to come back up. Suddenly now they're trapped, and someone has trapped them. It's not just something to investigate now, it's something to be solved, and they have a personal motivation against this saboteur. Act 2 starts with the group, the Silvered Sky. The Silvered Sky move against the players. They've learned too much. They managed to escape the mining rig. They've thwarted the saboteur. And now the Silvered Sky is after them. The discovery, the thing that was discovered in the mines, news of it spreads, and the players obtain the artifact. So now they have the MacGuffin, and it pretty much is a MacGuffin. I almost completely described it as a MacGuffin because what it was isn't as important as the fact that they have it and someone else wants it. So that's the beat for Act 2. Moves on to Act 3. This is where the big dramatic stuff starts happening. The sort of twists as you expect. This is where the people who've been funding the players, so their bosses, turn out to not be who they claimed. They're actually been trying to recover this item. They desperately want the MacGuffin. So there's this encounter where the players come in, they have the MacGuffin, they turn it over to their bosses. And it seems like the exact exchange that they expect, except there's something not quite right. And that's exactly the kind of thing I do. This is a tricky part because it depends entirely upon your players. The amount of intrigue kind of hinges on, is intrigue a focus of your game? Will your players pick up on hints? And I have found more often than not, as a player and a game master, hints are kind of worthless. The same goes for clues. The Alexandrian, which is a great blog, has what they call the 3-clue rule for running mysteries, where you have 3 clues, and they're not all tied to the same thing. So the fact, players should discover at least one of them. And this kind of goes into don't make a red herring, because your players will make their own red herrings. They will fixate on something and make it important because of their focus. My brother had this example from a game that he played in. They went into this laboratory, and the laboratory was full of alchemical stuff, retorts and glassware and crucibles and weird diagrams. And in the middle of the room, the game master described a chair. So There's all this stuff that he puts a ton of detail into, all around the room, equipment and strange powders and jars of liquid. And then he says, and in the middle of the room, there is a chair. And unintentionally put the player's focus on the chair, which happened to just be a small wooden stool. And suddenly, the players didn't care at all about the mysterious bound tome of alchemical lore that they'd been sent after. They cared about the chair. So that's kind of the thing. It's like the chair has no purpose in the room. It's set dressing, a lot like the mysterious liquids in jars. It makes sense to have a chair in an alchemist's lab. But the players are like, the way the GM described, and in the middle of the room, there is a chair. They made it important. So that's why you don't do red herrings, because your players will make them for themselves. The game master in this case happened to be pretty clever, and so they did a trick. And this is one of those ones that's a little bit difficult to do as a game master, because you have to be very careful about it, because it can give the wrong idea and vindicate the players. If you make their red herring important, that rewards players for picking up on random things. So if you're going to do that, I wouldn't make it important for what you're doing at this time. And this is what this GM did, because my brother was telling me about this story, is so the chair, they ended up having a note taped to the bottom of it, a drawing with some alchemical symbols on it. And it was stuck to the bottom with like tape or some tacks or something. And they thought it was a clue, and it is, but it wasn't a clue for what they were doing at that time. The game master just decided that for the next important thing, this would be the clue for it. So he had them find something, but didn't let the payoff happen then. Don't set up one path in a plot. Leave multiple paths. And that's what I do with my story beats. So I didn't have anything planned for what happens when the players find out that their employers have been lying to them. I didn't write any of those details. I didn't plan an encounter with the guards. I didn't plan a monologue. I just had the information come to the players, and I let them decide what they wanted to do with it. And they decided on something I wouldn't have expected from. Instead of confronting the boss, they kept it a secret. They were like, okay, the boss is up to something no good. And they plotted to steal back the MacGuffin. And they provided at least 3 sessions worth of story themselves in trying to find out, okay, where is it being kept? Who has it? What are the defenses? How do we bypass them? And it became this whole heist. And so they planned a complete heist that I couldn't have planned. They just started asking questions, and I started coming up with answers for those questions. Where's the MacGuffin kept? Oh, it's kept in the vault, with all the other things that the society you work for has endeavored to obtain. Okay. Do we know where the vault is? And so on and so forth. And just string these together. And then you get to the big final scene, the climactic showdown. And so when I set out to plan my story, all I really planned was a saboteur has shut down a mining rig. The players are sent to investigate. The people that are employing the players are not who they say they are. The confrontation with the people pulling the strings results in the MacGuffin being used and starts off a doomsday scenario that has to be stopped. Those are the only 3 plot points that I came up for the entire 24 session campaign that lasted a year. There's, we did like every other week sometimes. School semesters are hard to work around sometimes, but yeah. Suddenly you wing it because your players saw a shiny. And this can be anything, and players will do this. And this is where the collaborative element in storytelling comes in, and how planning can put you into more problems than it's worth. One of my good friends, he planned out a campaign that started on a train. And this was a really cool concept because, so trains, ships are kind of indicative of what you kind of call like a bottle episode, to use the TV tropes kind of trope terminology. They fit the players in a constrained environment that it's not easy to get to or leave from. It forces people together immediately and gives them something to work off of immediately. It starts off great for mystery because, look at the Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie. There's a murder that happens on a train. That's the entire point. Poirot is on his way somewhere and witnesses a murder. Because of course he does, because he's Poirot. And that's the impetus for the entire story there. So he had these players start off on a train that breaks down. And there's a nearby town that has an ill reputation, and he went on to details and details and details and details and details. He had every possible action, intent, what was going on in the town, plotted and planned before session 1. And the players never left the train. Because they were supposed to be on the train. The premise was that they were traveling by train to this other place, and they bought into that premise. So when the train broke down, they waited for the train to be repaired. And that's kind of the disconnect between what is promised and what is delivered. Yeah. And that's why, my friend had spent probably somewhere around 3 weeks, about an hour or 2 a night planning what happens in the town when the train wheels crack. And he used none of it. And a lot of the details he had were super hyper specific to this one place, so they couldn't really be reused. Can't shift them away. Let's see. Faulty's brought up something very nice about Session 0 starting in a bar campfire. What to do besides that? The traditional is there's a mysterious stranger in a cloak at the tavern. And they're the ones who give the players an adventure to go do something or other because of reasons. It's a trope. I don't use it. Almost all of my stories start out with the players already being involved. And this is the kind of thing that comes up. I was talking with my brother because he's been doing a little bit of GMing and he's played in way more games than I have because I've mostly been running them. I'm going to bring it back to the stool. The game master said, in the middle of the room, there is a chair. He made it important. So some way to do it when you're starting a campaign, a new game, is in the very first session, describe your character, the things that we already know about you. So, your mysterious cloaked ranger with their bow and arrow and their animal companion who is fierce and fun. And I'm really bad at drawing because I'm not focusing on drawing, I'm focusing on storytelling. They have their animal companion and they have their bow and they have their character concept. So instead of saying, this is how I describe me, it's like, I'm describing things you already know because now the Game Master's put it in that context. Describe to us what our characters already know about you. It's a small change in the wording, but it makes a big difference in how people approach it. Because they'll say, okay, well, you know that I am an elf ranger and I use a bow. I have a tiger animal companion. And you know that I'm always carrying around with me a small journal with a metal clasp. And I don't open it. I don't seem to be able to open it, but I always carry it with me. So we know something about this character now, and it's put in the context of we already know this person. We're already aware of these things. The adventuring group isn't a bunch of random strangers. It's a group of people who've been working together already. And this is where I almost always begin my campaigns, with the players already knowing each other and already being sent to a task, involved in something. I began a campaign in the middle of a fight. I had 4 level 1 players. I believe I had a wizard, and I had I believe it was a ranger, and they were wielding, bows because bows are awesome. I had a ranger. That's not how you wield a bow. And there was a cleric. And I believe the last person was a rogue. So, this is the party the players made. And they were off. They haven't been told what they're doing yet. The premise of this campaign is that you're seeking out an ancient burial ground said to hold the mortal remains of a hero who became a god. Yeah, no bard. No one built a bard. Love bards, though. So, I have these 4 characters, these 4 players. 2 of them were brand new to D&D. They'd never played anything before. They were playing the ranger and the rogue. And what I did is I threw them immediately into a combat. I actually began the opening of the campaign in the middle of combat, not at the beginning of a combat. I fudged a few numbers, made things up. It's like, okay, you're in the middle of this fight. You were resting in the night on the road to the temple, and you've been ambushed by goblins. Because, ambushed by goblins. And you've already managed to slay 3 of the goblins. And the one that's left is a little bit different. Is bigger and bulkier, seems to have been the leader, and you can tell he's getting ready to run. So I basically put a little bit of damage on each of the players that seemed reasonable, so nothing significant. And I said, all right, you were ambushed by goblins. You've already slain 3 of them. This guy is a little bit battered, but he looks like he's about to run. And here's your initiatives. And I'd already rolled for them an initiative, so the rogue went like really, really fast. They had like a 19. The ranger had like a, I want to say a 14. The wizard was at like a 9, and the cleric had absolutely pitiful roll, and I think they were at like a 4. So the first things that people who have a chance to act are the brand new players. They're being thrown immediately into combat with mechanics they're unfamiliar with because, hey, you've already been fighting. You've got a little bit of this going on. You're in the middle of this. It's your turn to act. What are you doing? And putting it in the context of a fight where you have a distinctive kind of goal, especially since he's about to run, and that's a detail I made clear, suddenly puts into motion, okay, how do I act in this situation? It's not, you come into a tavern and you see a mysterious stranger. What do you do? And that question, what do you do? This is the most common question I have heard as a game master from my own lips, from other people running stories. So what do you do? And you've been given no direction. You have only the vaguest sense. It's session 1. You don't really have a concept of your character fully fleshed out in terms of who they are personality-wise, but suddenly I've given you something to act on, something immediate that has to be decided now. And my brand new player surprised me, because they've been wanting to build this combat monster, this rogue who is super great at backstabbing, and I helped them put it together. And they're like, one of the languages I have is Goblin. I'm like, yes, it is. Oh, yep, gotta wrap this up. We've got guest of honor meeting coming up. So they, instead of fighting, they took out one of the items they had, a tanglefoot bag, and they trapped the goblin. And when it was the ranger's turn, they moved immediately over with rope, and they tied the goblin up, and they took him hostage, and they interrogated him for the information of why were the goblins attacking them. So instead of having the whole session being like, well, how do you know so-and-so? How, I'm trying to get the game running. There are certain things you have to do to make the game work. You have to say, I'm going to join up with these other people to go on this adventure. I basically sidestepped that and said, you already know each other, you're already involved with each other, and you're already on an adventure. You're in an immediate situation that you have to act in. And then after that fight, where we interrogated the goblin, we learned a lot of things. The players got a good sense of who their characters were personality-wise by just jumping into the middle of things. And this brings me to my very last topic, which is where to go now and Hixvent Draconis. So what comes next? What's left on the map? And these are places that are vague geography, labels reading, here there be dragons. And in the story sense, this is, so you've managed to get some players together, and you've managed to start a game. How do you keep it going? You work with your players. You work on that collaborative storytelling. You work on helping them have an adventure. This is the most crucial rule of all. In all of tabletop, it's true in Vampire the Masquerade, it's true in Fate, it's true in every edition of D&D I have played, including 4th. The goal of a tabletop game is to have fun. Fun as a player, fun as a game master. And discussing what is and isn't fun, getting a feel as a game master for what your players are looking for, getting a sense of how your story might shape out without planning the ending in full detail because you haven't got there yet, that is part of the experience. I know Faulty mentioned problem players at one point. I have found very few players in 14 years that I haven't been able to, show a good time. Killjoy PC, it says nothing and interacts even less in the world and kills the motivations and enjoyments of other party members. This one's tricky. If it's a character that's doing that, discuss that with the player. Let them know that unfortunately, because they're not interacting with things, they're not engaging with what's going on, you're not sure how to engage them. Find out what's bringing them to your table. Why are they playing? If it's a player who is a killjoy and is doing nothing helpful and is antagonistic to your other players, it's tough to do, but I'd say remove them from your group. Talk with them, sure, if you can help them change their ways, great. But sometimes it comes down to it and it's just the player's not a good fit for your table. I've had amazing players build terrible characters who weren't engaged in anything, and I had long talks with them about what was bringing them to the table, what was motivating them to play their character, what were they wanting out of my game. And I've also had players who were like, I built an amazing character and the character's really cool, but I am being... So, have a talk with them. It could be nerves. Could be people who are being nervous. A lot of players who are unfamiliar with tabletop roleplay and live action roleplay are paralyzed with nerves. What if you do something wrong? What if you say something dumb? So talk with them. Get to know your players, and I guarantee they and you will have a better time. And I believe that wraps up most of what I learned in a decade of game mastering. So, thanks everyone for coming and checking it out. Up next is our guest of honor panel with Cooper Tom. Don't want to miss that. I know I'm going to be switching over there to check that out myself. So, thanks everyone for coming, and may you roll 20s if you're playing a D20 based system. May you roll well if you're playing something else.